The gunshot that tore through the evening air made Daisy Harrington drop the basket of laundry she'd been carrying. She froze, her heart hammering against her rib cage as another shot followed, closer this time. Montana Territory, 1878, was no place for a woman alone, especially not with the sun beginning to set over the rugged landscape that surrounded her father's modest homestead. Daisy's blue calico skirt whipped around her ankles as she abandoned the scattered clothing and ran for the safety of the cabin. Her father was in town for supplies and wouldn't return until morning. She'd been alone on the property many times before, but something about the proximity of those gunshots sent ice through her veins. She reached the porch just as the sound of thundering hooves approached from the east. Daisy turned, one hand on the door latch, to see a rider emerging from the tree line, hunched low over his horse's neck. Behind him, 3 more riders appeared, their guns drawn and firing. The lead rider spotted her and veered toward the cabin. As he drew closer, Daisy could see blood staining his left sleeve. His face was partially obscured by dust and the shadow of his hat brim, but his eyes caught hers intense, desperate, and startlingly blue. "Please," he called out, his voice strained but steady. "Help me." Daisy had seconds to decide. Her father had always warned her about strangers, especially in these lawless parts, but something in the man's voice, in those eyes, made her hesitate. The approaching riders were gaining ground. Making her decision, she flung open the door. "In here. Quickly." The man dismounted in one fluid motion despite his injury, slapping his horse's flank to send it running as he stumbled toward the cabin. Daisy pulled him inside and slammed the door, dropping the heavy wooden bar into place just as the other riders reached the yard. "They'll kill me if they find me," the man said, leaning against the wall, his breathing labored. "And you too, most likely." "Who are they?" Daisy asked, peering through a crack in the shutters at the men circling the cabin.
"Callaway gun.
"I had the misfortune of winning at cards against the youngest brother." He grimaced, clutching his arm. "Name's Flynn Blackwood. I apologize for bringing trouble to your door, Mississippi." "Daisy Harrington," she replied automatically, then immediately regretted giving her real name to a stranger. "You're bleeding." Flynn nodded grimly. "Just a graze, but it needs tending." Outside, the men had dismounted and were approaching the cabin cautiously. "Harrington," one of them shouted, "we know you're harboring a thief. Send him out, and we'll leave you be." Daisy's eyes widened. "They know my name." "Everyone knows old Matthew Harrington's place," Flynn explained, his voice low. "And that he has a daughter." "Is your father here?" She shook her head. "In town until tomorrow." A heavy fist pounded on the door. "Open up, girl. We just want what's ours." Flynn straightened, wincing with the effort. "I didn't steal anything. One fair and square." He reached for his holster, then cursed softly. "Lost my gun when they started shooting." Daisy moved quickly to the fireplace and pulled down her father's shotgun from its mount. She loaded it with practiced ease, earning a raised eyebrow from Flynn. "My father taught me," she explained simply, moving to the window. She cracked the shutter and called out, "My father left for the marshal. Should be back any minute now with help." There was a moment of silence before the men conferred in hushed tones. Finally, the same voice called back, "We'll be waiting in those trees, girl. If your friend tries to leave, he's dead. And if we find out you're lying about the marshal." The threat hung in the air. The sound of retreating footsteps followed, and Daisy watched through the crack as the men mounted their horses and rode toward the tree line, disappearing into the gathering darkness. "They'll wait a while, but they're not patient men," Flynn said, sliding down the wall to sit on the floor. "I don't suppose there's another way out of here?" Daisy shook her head, setting the shotgun aside and kneeling beside him. "Let me see your arm." She helped him remove his jacket and rolled up his sleeve. The bullet had indeed only grazed him, but it had left a nasty furrow that was still bleeding steadily. I need to clean this, she said, rising to fetch water and supplies. It'll sting. Flynn's laugh was more of a grunt. Not my first bullet wound, Miss Harrington. As Daisy worked on his arm, she studied him surreptitiously. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps mid-20s, with a strong jawline shadowed with stubble. His dark hair was a bit too long, curling slightly where it met his collar. Despite his situation, there was an easy confidence in the way he held himself. You handle a gun well for a homesteader's daughter, Flynn observed as she wrapped a clean bandage around his arm. And you're awfully calm for a man with killers waiting outside, she countered. His mouth quirked up at one corner. Fair point. He studied her for a moment. How old are you, Miss Harrington? 20, she answered, tying off the bandage. And you? 26 next month if I live that long. There was no self-pity in his tone, just a matter-of-fact acknowledgement of his situation. Are you really a thief? Daisy asked directly, sitting back on her heels. Flynn's blue eyes met hers.
No, madam.
I'm a rancher from up north. Was heading to Helena on business, stopped for a game of cards. Won $300 and the youngest Calloway couldn't accept losing fair and square. Something in his steady gaze convinced her he was telling the truth. Daisy nodded once and stood up. You should rest. I'll keep watch for a while. I can take first watch, he offered, but Daisy shook her head. You're injured, and it's my home. She picked up the shotgun again. I know how to use this. Flynn looked like he wanted to argue, but instead nodded and leaned his head back against the wall. Wake me in 2 hours to switch. Daisy took a seat by the window, positioning herself where she could see the tree line while remaining hidden from view. The night was quiet except for the occasional distant howl of a coyote and the soft sound of Flynn's breathing, which gradually deepened as he drifted to sleep despite his injuries and their predicament. She studied his face in repose, noticing how the hard lines softened in sleep. He was handsome. She had to admit the kind of man her friend Becky would have swooned over in town. But Daisy had always prided herself on being practical. Handsome or not, Flynn Blackwood had brought danger to her door, and her priority was ensuring they both survived until morning when her father returned. Still, as the hours passed and the cabin grew colder, Daisy found herself wondering about the mysterious cowboy. There was something in his eyes that spoke of experiences beyond her own limited world. Having lived her entire life on this homestead, her interactions with men limited to her father, the occasional ranch hand, and the aging shopkeepers in town, Flynn represented something entirely unknown. When 2 hours had passed, Daisy hesitated to wake him. He needed the rest to heal, and she wasn't particularly tired. But as if sensing her gaze, Flynn's eyes suddenly opened, instantly alert. Your watch is over, he said, his voice husky with sleep. He sat up, wincing slightly, but seeming stronger than before. I'm not tired, Daisy protested. Doesn't matter. Need to keep our wits about us. He rose to his feet and crossed to the window, taking the shotgun from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers in the exchange, and Daisy felt an unexpected warmth at the brief contact. Any movement out there? He asked, peering through the crack in the shutters. Nothing. But they could be waiting for us to let our guard down. Flynn nodded. Get some rest. I'll wake you if anything changes. Reluctantly, Daisy moved to the small cot in the corner of the room. She lay down but kept her eyes open, watching Flynn's silhouette by the window. Mr. Blackwood? She said after a few minutes of silence. Flynn, he corrected. Seems we're past formalities when there are men outside waiting to kill me. Despite everything, Daisy smiled in the darkness. Flynn, then. Why ranching? He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft in the stillness of the cabin. My father was a rancher. His father before him. I tried other things, was a scout for the army for a while, did some driving for freight companies. But there's something about building something of your own, watching it grow.
He paused.
What about you? Always been a homesteader? Yes, Daisy said, though I've dreamed of other places. My mother had book stories about cities back east, about Europe. Sometimes I imagine what it would be like to see those places. Why don't you? Daisy sighed. My father needs me. After my mother died 6 years ago. Well, someone has to keep things running. Flynn was silent again, and when he spoke, his voice held a note of understanding that surprised her. Responsibility has a way of setting our paths for us, doesn't it? Yes, Daisy whispered, feeling a strange connection to this man she'd just met. It does. The night deepened around them, and eventually, despite her intention to stay alert, the rhythmic sound of Flynn checking the windows and his quiet movements lulled Daisy into sleep. She dreamed of open plains and distant mountains, of riding fast across terrain she'd never seen. And somewhere in the dream, a man with blue eyes rode beside her, free of pursuit, free of danger. Daisy awoke with a start as the first hint of dawn filtered through the shutters. Flynn was standing by the window, his posture tense. They're still there, he said without turning. I can see movement at the edge of the trees. She rose quickly, smoothing her rumpled dress. My father should be back soon. He always starts for home at first light when he's been in town. Flynn glanced at her. That could complicate things. They might use him to draw us out. The realization sent a chill through Daisy. We need to warn him somehow. Flynn considered this, his brow furrowed. Is there a back way to the property? A trail your father might use that they wouldn't know about. Daisy thought for a moment. There's an old game trail that connects to the main road about a mile east. Pa sometimes uses it when the main approach is muddy. If I create a distraction, could you slip out and intercept him? What kind of distraction? Daisy asked warily. Flynn's mouth set in a grim line. The kind that draws their attention completely away from you. I'll make a run for the barn. Make them think I'm trying to get a horse. While they're focused on me, you go out the back and take that trail. They'll shoot you, Daisy protested. Maybe. Maybe not. I'm pretty fast. He attempted a confident smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Besides, I can't let them hurt you or your father because of my bad luck at choosing card partners. It's too dangerous, Daisy insisted. There must be another way. Flynn's expression softened. Miss Harrington, Daisy, I've been in worse situations. Trust me. Something in his steady gaze made her want to believe him, but the thought of him facing those men alone tied her stomach in knots. It confused her, this sudden concern for a stranger who'd brought danger to her door. Let me think, she said, pacing the small room. There might be another way. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the yard, Daisy formulated a plan. It was risky, but not as dangerous as Flynn's suicide run to the barn. The root cellar, she said finally. It connects to a ventilation tunnel that comes out behind the woodpile. It's narrow, but a person could crawl through it. Flynn raised an eyebrow. Your father built an escape tunnel? It wasn't intentional, Daisy explained. The soil shifted after a flood 2 springs ago, creating a sort of natural passage. Pa reinforced it rather than filling it in, said it helped with air circulation.
She paused.
I could use it to circle around behind them. Absolutely not, Flynn said firmly. I won't let you put yourself in danger. It's not your decision, Daisy replied, her chin lifting stubbornly. This is my home, and my father who's in danger. Besides, they're not looking for me, they're looking for you. They argued back and forth, but in the end, Flynn grudgingly agreed that her plan had merit. He insisted on going through the tunnel himself, but Daisy pointed out that he was too large to fit comfortably, and his injury would make crawling difficult. I'll go through the tunnel and circle behind them, she explained. All I need to do is get far enough to see the main road. If Pa is coming, I can warn him. If not, I'll come back the same way. Flynn ran a hand through his hair in frustration. And if they catch you? They won't, Daisy said with more confidence than she felt. I grew up in these woods. I know how to move quietly. After more debate, Flynn finally relented, but with conditions. You take my pocket watch. If you're not back in 30 minutes, I'm coming after you, guns or no guns. Daisy nodded, accepting the silver timepiece. Their fingers touched again during the exchange, and this time the contact lingered a moment longer than necessary. Daisy felt heat rise to her cheeks and quickly stepped back. Be careful, Flynn said softly. I will. The entrance to the root cellar was hidden beneath a rug in the kitchen. Daisy moved quietly, lifting the trapdoor and peering into the darkness below. The earthy smell of stored potatoes and onions wafted up. The tunnel entrance is behind the far shelf, she whispered. I'll need a lantern. Flynn handed her a small oil lamp, already lit. 30 minutes, he reminded her. Daisy nodded and began her descent into the cellar. At the bottom, she looked up to see Flynn watching her, his face a mask of concern. She offered what she hoped was a reassuring smile before turning to navigate between the shelves of preserved foods. The tunnel entrance was exactly as she remembered it, a narrow opening barely wider than her shoulders. Taking a deep breath, Daisy set the lantern in front of her and began to crawl forward on her hands and knees. The passage was longer than she recalled, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. Twice she had to stop and calm her breathing when the walls seemed to close in around her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she saw a glimmer of light ahead. Emerging behind the woodpile, Daisy extinguished the lantern and carefully peered around the stacked logs. The men's horses were tied at the edge of the trees, but she couldn't see the riders themselves. They must be spread out, watching the cabin from different positions. Moving as silently as possible, Daisy kept to the shadows, using every bit of cover available as she made her way toward the east side of the property. Once in the tree line, she moved faster, her heart pounding with each step. She had gone perhaps a quarter mile when she heard the unmistakable sound of a horse approaching. Crouching behind a fallen log, Daisy waited, praying it was her father and not one of the Calloway gang. Relief flooded through her as the familiar figure of Matthew Harrington came into view, riding his old dun mare at a steady pace. Daisy stepped out onto the trail, waving her arms to catch his attention. Her father reined in sharply, his weathered face creasing with concern. Daisy, what in tarnation are you doing out here alone? Quickly, she explained the situation. Matthew's expression darkened as she spoke.
Calloways, he spat.
Worthless bunch of coyotes. How many? 3 that I saw, Daisy answered. They're watching the cabin, waiting for Mr. Blackwood to try to leave. Matthew considered this information. And you trust this Flynn fellow? He's telling the truth. Daisy hesitated only briefly. Yes, Pa. I believe him. Her father studied her face for a moment, then nodded. All right then. Here's what we'll do. Back at the cabin, Flynn was counting the minutes, growing more anxious with each passing second. The pocket watch lay open in his palm, the second hand ticking relentlessly. 25 minutes had passed since Daisy had disappeared into the root cellar. Just as he was preparing to follow her, regardless of the risk, he heard a commotion outside. Moving to the window, he saw a man on horseback approaching from the main road, riding with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Matthew Harrington, he presumed. The hidden watchers emerged from their positions, guns drawn, intercepting the rider before he reached the cabin. Morning, gentlemen, Matthew called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Seems you're trespassing on my property. One of the men stepped forward, a tall, lean figure with a distinctive red bandana around his neck. We're after a thief hiding in your cabin, Harrington. Send him out, and we'll be on our way. Ain't nobody in my cabin but my daughter, Matthew replied calmly. And I'd take it kindly if you'd lower those weapons. Your daughter's harboring a cheat who stole from my brother, the man insisted. We saw him go in there yesterday. Matthew dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. Well now, that's interesting because I've been at that cabin all night and there's no stranger there. Flynn's brow furrowed in confusion. What game was the old man playing? You calling me a liar? The man with the bandana took a threatening step forward. Not at all, Mr. Calloway. Just suggesting you might be mistaken. Matthew's voice remained even. Feel free to search the place if you don't believe me. Flynn tensed. If they searched the cabin, they'd find him immediately. He looked around frantically for a place to hide, but the one-room structure offered few options. The back door creaked open, and Flynn spun around, raising the shotgun. Daisy slipped inside, putting a finger to her lips. My father's creating a diversion, she whispered. Quick, into the root cellar. Flynn hesitated. I won't hide while your father faces those men alone. Trust him, Daisy urged. He knows what he's doing. Reluctantly, Flynn followed her to the trapdoor. As they descended into the cellar, they could hear footsteps on the porch and Matthew's voice greeting the men as if they were expected visitors. See for yourselves, Matthew was saying as the door opened. Nobody here but me. Heavy boots moved across the floorboards above them. Flynn and Daisy remained perfectly still in the dimness of the root cellar, listening to the search taking place overhead. Check under the bed, someone ordered. What about this rug? Another voice asked, and for a heart-stopping moment, Daisy thought they'd discovered the trapdoor. But Matthew's voice cut in smoothly. That's covering a weak spot in the floorboards. Been meaning to fix it, but you know how it is with a homestead, always something more pressing. The footsteps moved away from the kitchen area, and Daisy released the breath she'd been holding. In the close confines of the cellar, she was acutely aware of Flynn beside her, his arm brushing against hers as they stood in tense silence. After what seemed like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, and the cabin door closed. Through the floorboards, they could hear Matthew bidding the men goodbye, his tone conversational, as if they'd just paid a social call. Wait here, Daisy whispered. I'll check if it's safe. She started toward the ladder, but Flynn caught her arm. In the dim light filtering through the cracks in the floorboards, his eyes looked almost luminous. Thank you, he said softly, for risking yourself to help me. Something in his gaze made Daisy's heart flutter strangely. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and continued up the ladder. Matthew was alone in the cabin when she emerged. He helped her out of the cellar, then peered down at Flynn. You must be the card player who's got the Calloways riled up, he said, his tone neutral. Flynn climbed out and stood tall, meeting the older man's evaluating gaze. Yes, sir. Flynn Blackwood. I apologize for bringing trouble to your door. Matthew studied him for a long moment before extending his hand. Matthew Harrington. Any man the Calloways hate can't be all bad in my book. Flynn shook his hand, relief evident in his expression. They believed you? That I wasn't here? For now, Matthew said, moving to the window to look out. Told them I'd been here all night, and since they never actually saw inside the cabin until now, they couldn't prove otherwise. Said they probably followed some other fella. They're headed back to town, but they'll be suspicious. What now?
Daisy asked.
Matthew scratched his beard thoughtfully. They'll likely come back once they realize I tricked them. Mr. Blackwood here needs to be long gone by then. Flynn nodded. I appreciate the help, Mr. Harrington. I'll leave as soon as possible. You'll need a horse, Matthew pointed out. And that arm looks like it could use more tending. I've bandaged it, Daisy said. But he should rest before traveling. Matthew gave his daughter a curious look, noting the concern in her voice. I suppose you could stay until nightfall, he conceded. Less chance of being spotted leaving after dark. I've got a mare you can borrow, not much to look at, but she's steady. I'm grateful, Flynn said sincerely. As Matthew went to check that the Calloways were truly gone, Daisy busied herself preparing a late breakfast. Flynn watched her move about the kitchen, struck by her quiet efficiency and the grace with which she handled even simple tasks. "Your father seems like a good man," he commented. Daisy smiled, the expression transforming her face in a way that made Flynn's breath catch.
"He is.
Tough but fair. He's raised me alone since my mother died." "He's done a fine job," Flynn said, then felt heat rise to his face at the forwardness of the compliment. Daisy's cheeks colored slightly as she set a plate of biscuits and bacon before him.
"Eat.
"You'll need your strength." They shared the meal in companionable silence until Matthew returned, confirming that the Calloways had indeed left the property. As they discussed Flynn's departure plans, Daisy found herself growing increasingly quiet, a hollow feeling forming in her chest at the thought of him leaving. It was ridiculous, she told herself. She barely knew this man. Yet in the short time he'd been in their cabin, something had shifted in her world. His presence had awakened a longing she hadn't recognized before, not just for him specifically, but for experiences beyond the boundaries of her small existence. Throughout the day, as Flynn rested and prepared for his journey, Daisy caught herself watching him, the way his hands moved as he cleaned his pistol, which Matthew had retrieved from where it had fallen during his escape, the thoughtful expression he wore as he studied her father's maps to plan his route, the rare smile that transformed his serious face when something amused him. As evening approached, the tension in the cabin grew. Flynn would be leaving soon, and Daisy felt an inexplicable sadness at the thought. She busied herself packing provisions for his journey, avoiding his gaze whenever possible. Matthew noticed the strange atmosphere between the two young people but said nothing, merely raising an eyebrow when he caught his daughter's sneaking glances at their guest. After dinner, as twilight deepened into night, Matthew announced he would go prepare the mare for Flynn's journey. Before leaving the cabin, he fixed Flynn with a stern look. "You seem like a decent sort, Blackwood. But my daughter's reputation is worth more than gold to me. You understand?" Flynn straightened. "Yes, sir. You have nothing to worry about." Matthew nodded once and stepped outside, leaving Daisy and Flynn alone in the cabin lit only by the soft glow of oil lamps. An awkward silence fell between them. Daisy moved to clear the dishes, but Flynn rose and caught her hand. "Daisy," he said softly, "I don't know how to thank you properly for what you did today." She looked up at him, suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. Anyone would have done the same. Flynn shook his head.
"No.
Most would have turned me away, or handed me over to save themselves trouble." His thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles. "You're something special, Daisy Harrington." Her heart hammered in her chest, and words seemed to stick in her throat. Flynn was looking at her in a way no man ever had before, and it made her feel both terrified and exhilarated. "Will you go back to your ranch?" she managed to ask.
"Eventually," he said.
"Need to lie low for a while first. The Calloways have a long reach." Daisy nodded, trying to ignore the disappointment that washed through her. What had she expected? That he would stay? That was foolish. This man had his own life, his own path. "I've never met anyone like you," Flynn continued, his voice low. "In another life, under different circumstances." He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. In another world, perhaps they could have explored whatever this strange connection between them was. But reality stood firmly in their way. "I should finish packing your provisions," Daisy said, gently withdrawing her hand from his. Flynn let her go, watching as she moved around the cabin gathering supplies. The silence between them now held a different quality, heavier, laden with unspoken words and possibilities that would never be realized. When Matthew returned, announcing that the horse was ready, Flynn gathered his few belongings. At the door, he turned to Daisy one last time. "If you're ever up north, near the Bitterroot Valley," he began. "Blackwood Ranch," she finished for him with a small smile. "I'll remember." Their eyes held for a long moment before Flynn nodded to Matthew and stepped out into the night. Daisy moved to the window, watching as he mounted the mare and rode slowly away from the cabin. It was foolish to feel such loss for someone who had been in her life for barely a day, yet she couldn't deny the ache in her chest as his figure disappeared into the darkness. "Seems like a good man," Matthew said, coming to stand beside her. Despite his choice in card partners, Daisy smiled weakly. "Yes, he does." Her father studied her face for a moment. "You've got that same look your mother had when she was thinking too hard about something. Want to tell me what's on your mind?" Daisy sighed. "It's nothing, Pa. Just tired from all the excitement." Matthew didn't press, but as he moved away to bank the fire for the night, he said casually, "You know, I was thinking we might take a trip up to Helena next month. Got some business to attend to with the land office. Might be nice for you to see something beyond this homestead for a change." Daisy turned to him, suspicious of the timing of this announcement. "Helena? That's quite a journey." Matthew shrugged. "Been meaning to go for a while now. And the Bitterroot Valley's not far from there, as I recall." Heat rushed to Daisy's cheeks.
Pa.
Her father's weathered face creased in a rare smile. "Just an observation, daughter. Just an observation." The weeks that followed passed in a blur of routine tasks, but Daisy found her thoughts constantly drifting to Flynn Blackwood. She chided herself for this foolishness dwelling on a man she'd known for less than a day, a man who was probably miles away by now, perhaps already forgetting the homesteader's daughter who had helped him escape. True to his word, Matthew began making preparations for a journey to Helena. Daisy tried to temper her excitement, telling herself it was the prospect of seeing a real city that thrilled her, not the possibility of perhaps crossing paths with a certain blue-eyed rancher. A month after Flynn's hasty departure, as Daisy was hanging laundry in the yard, she spotted a rider approaching from the direction of town. Her heart leapt before she could check the reaction, but as the figure drew closer, she saw it was only Ben Tucker, the blacksmith's son who sometimes delivered messages from town. "Morning, Miss Harrington," Ben called, reining in his horse. "Got a letter for your pa." Daisy wiped her hands on her apron and approached to take the envelope.
Thank you, Ben.
"Would you like some water before you head back?" The young man shook his head. "Got more deliveries to make. But thanks all the same." He tipped his hat and turned his horse, then hesitated. "Oh, almost forgot. There was a fella asking about you in town yesterday." Daisy's pulse quickened. "About me?" Ben nodded. Tall fellow, dark hair. Had a fancy bay stallion. Asked where the Harrington place was. Told him you were a few miles east. He grinned. "Got yourself a suitor, Miss Harrington?" Daisy tried to keep her expression neutral despite the fluttering in her stomach. "Probably just someone with business for my father. Thank you for letting me know." As Ben rode away, Daisy found herself smoothing her hair and straightening her dress. Could it be Flynn? But why would he come back? The Callaways might still be watching for him. She tried to focus on her chores, but her eyes kept drifting to the road, scanning for any sign of a rider. By late afternoon, she had convinced herself that Ben had been mistaken, or that the stranger asking questions had nothing to do with Flynn Blackwood. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Daisy was in the garden harvesting vegetables for dinner when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She straightened, shading her eyes against the golden light of the setting sun. A rider was coming down the main road, silhouetted against the fiery sky. As he drew closer, Daisy's heart began to race. Even at a distance, she recognized the straight-backed posture, the easy way he sat in the saddle. Flynn Blackwood had returned. She stood frozen among the rows of vegetables, unable to move as he approached the cabin. He dismounted gracefully, tying his horse a magnificent bay stallion, just as Ben had described to the hitching post. When he turned and saw her standing in the garden, he removed his hat, revealing hair that had been trimmed since she'd last seen him. "Miss Harrington," he called, his voice carrying across the yard. "Hope I'm not intruding." Daisy found her voice at last. "Mr. Blackwood, this is unexpected." He approached slowly, stopping at the edge of the garden. Up close, she could see that he looked well, his face tanned from the sun, his injured arm showing no sign of the wound that had brought him to her door. "I was in the area," he said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Thought I'd stop by to properly thank you and your father for your help." "In the area?" Daisy repeated skeptically. "This isn't exactly on the way to anywhere." Flynn's smile widened. "Well, perhaps I took a slight detour." The sound of the cabin door opening drew their attention. Matthew stood on the porch, rifle in hand, though he lowered it when he recognized their visitor. "Blackwood," he acknowledged with a nod. "Didn't expect to see you again." Flynn replaced his hat and approached the porch, extending his hand. "Mr. Harrington, I've come to repay my debt to you and your daughter." Matthew shook his hand firmly. "No debt between us, but you're welcome all the same." He glanced at Daisy, who was still standing in the garden. "Daughter, don't leave our guest standing in the yard. Invite him in for supper." As Flynn turned back to look at her, the setting sun caught in his blue eyes, making them appear almost luminous. Daisy felt something shift inside her, a certainty that whatever happened next would change the course of her life forever. "Yes," she said, finding herself smiling. "Please join us, Mr. Blackwood." "Flynn," he corrected gently. "I think we're past formalities, don't you?" Over supper, Flynn explained that he had indeed returned to his ranch after leaving them, only to find that word of his run-in with the Callaways had spread. Several neighboring ranchers had approached him, sharing their own stories of the gang's intimidation tactics and thievery. "We formed an association," Flynn explained, "and took our evidence to the territorial marshal. He's been building a case against them for years, but never had enough witnesses willing to testify." "You're saying the Callaways have been arrested?" Matthew asked, leaning forward with interest. Flynn nodded. 2 days ago. The whole lot of them, including cousins and associates. They won't be troubling anyone for a long while." "That's why you felt safe returning here," Daisy realized. "Partly," Flynn admitted, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to her father. "But I also came with a proposition, Mr. Harrington." Matthew raised an eyebrow. "What sort of proposition?" "I'm expanding my operation," Flynn explained. "Looking for experienced men to help manage new sections of the ranch. The pay is good, and there's a comfortable house included." Daisy watched her father consider this unexpected offer. The homestead had never been particularly prosperous, and recent dry years had made farming even more challenging. "Why me?" Matthew asked directly. "There must be plenty of cowhands looking for work." "Because I need someone I can trust," Flynn answered. "Someone with integrity. And because—" He hesitated, glancing at Daisy. "I'd like the chance to get to know your daughter better, with your blessing." The directness of his statement left Daisy breathless. Matthew's eyebrows shot up, and he looked between the two young people, noting the way they couldn't seem to keep their eyes off each other. "I see," he said slowly. "And what does my daughter think of this arrangement?" All eyes turned to Daisy, who felt her cheeks flame with heat. I would like that opportunity as well," she admitted quietly. Matthew studied them both for a long moment, then nodded. "Well then, Mr. Blackwood, I believe we have business to discuss." As the men talked details into the evening, Daisy moved about the cabin, clearing dishes and preparing coffee, her mind whirling with possibilities. Was this really happening? Was she truly considering leaving the only home she'd ever known to follow a man she barely knew to a distant ranch? Yet something deep inside told her this was right. That Flynn Blackwood was someone special, someone worth taking a chance on. Later, as Matthew excused himself to check on something in the barn, leaving them alone for the first time since Flynn's arrival, an expectant silence fell between them. "I hope I wasn't too forward," Flynn said finally, rising from the table to stand near the fireplace where Daisy was arranging kindling for the morning. "With my father? Or with me?" she asked, not looking up from her task. "Both, I suppose." There was a hint of uncertainty in his voice that touched her. I know it seems sudden, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since I left. About your courage, your kindness. Daisy straightened, finally meeting his gaze. I've thought of you too, she admitted, though I told myself it was foolish to dwell on someone I barely knew. Flynn took a step closer. I'd like to change that. I want to know everything about you, Daisy Harrington. The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. There's not much to tell. I've lived a very ordinary life. I doubt anything about you is ordinary, Flynn said softly. They stood there, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Flynn's gaze dropped briefly to her lips, and Daisy felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. I've never, she began, then stopped embarrassed. Never what? Flynn prompted gently. Daisy gathered her courage. I've never been kissed, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Living out here, there haven't been many opportunities for that sort of thing. Understanding dawned in Flynn's eyes, followed by a tenderness that made Daisy's heart ache. I see, he said softly. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, he raised his hand to cup her cheek. May I be the first, then? He asked, his voice husky. Daisy nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Flynn leaned down, hesitating just a breath away from her lips, his eyes searching hers for any sign of reluctance. Finding none, he closed the final distance between them. The first touch of his lips against hers was gentle, questioning. Daisy stood frozen, overwhelmed by the new sensation. Flynn began to pull back, but she instinctively raised her hand to his chest, keeping him close. He smiled against her lips and kissed her again, more confidently this time. His arms slipped around her waist, drawing her closer as he showed her how a kiss could deepen, how it could speak volumes without words. Daisy followed his lead, learning the rhythm of give and take, the sweet pressure that sent warmth cascading through her body. When they finally parted, she was breathless, her heart racing as if she'd run miles. Was that? Did I do it right? She asked uncertainly. Flynn's laugh was soft and warm. Perfectly, he assured her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Though I think practice might be in order. The sound of boots on the porch steps gave them just enough warning to step apart before Matthew re-entered the cabin. He glanced between them, noting Daisy's flushed cheeks and Flynn's slightly mussed hair, but made no comment. Getting late, he observed casually. Blackwood, you're welcome to the spare cot for the night. Thank you, sir, Flynn replied, his composure recovered though his eyes still held a warmth when they glanced at Daisy. That night, lying in her narrow bed with only a curtain separating her from the main room where Flynn slept, Daisy replayed the kiss in her mind. Her lips still tingled from the memory, and her body hummed with a new awareness. In the darkness, she allowed herself to imagine a future at Flynn's ranch, a life beyond the boundaries of the homestead. A life with the possibility of many more such kisses, and perhaps someday, more than kisses. The thought both thrilled and frightened her. Was she ready for such a change? Could she really build a life with a man she was only beginning to know? Yet as she drifted toward sleep, Daisy realized that sometimes the heart recognized what the mind was still questioning. And her heart had recognized something in Flynn Blackwood from the very first moment their eyes had met. The journey to Flynn's ranch in the Bitterroot Valley took nearly a week, traveling in a wagon loaded with the Harringtons' belongings. Matthew had decided to lease rather than sell their homestead, keeping it as a fallback option should the arrangement with Flynn not work out. For Daisy, each mile brought a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She was leaving behind everything familiar, venturing into a new life based on little more than faith in a man she was still getting to know. During the journey, that knowledge deepened. She learned that Flynn had lost his mother as a child, that he had a younger sister who was married to a banker in Helena, that he played the harmonica on quiet evenings, and that he could name every constellation in the night sky. In turn, she shared stories of her mother, of growing up on the homestead, of her dreams of someday seeing the places she'd read about in books. Flynn listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he valued her thoughts and experiences. The physical aspects of their growing relationship progressed cautiously, always under Matthew's watchful eye. There were stolen kisses when her father rode ahead to scout the trail, hands that lingered when passing food or supplies, and long conversations by the campfire that often continued until Matthew pointedly suggested it was time for sleep. By the time they crested the final ridge and the Blackwood Ranch came into view, Daisy felt as though she'd known Flynn for years rather than weeks. The sight of the sprawling property below took her breath away, a large main house surrounded by several smaller buildings, corrals filled with horses, and meadows dotted with cattle stretching toward distant mountains. "It's beautiful," she breathed, taking in the panoramic view. Flynn, riding beside the wagon, watched her reaction with undisguised pleasure. "It's been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather built the main house, and I added the east wing 2 years ago." As they approached, several ranch hands rode out to meet them, greeting Flynn with easy familiarity and eyeing the newcomers with curious respect. Daisy felt suddenly self-conscious in her travel-worn dress, aware of the dust coating her skin and hair after days on the trail. Flynn must have sensed her discomfort, for he quickly guided the wagon to the main house, away from the curious eyes of his employees. An older woman with gray-streaked hair and a kind face emerged from the house as they arrived. "Mrs. Dalton, my housekeeper," Flynn explained as he helped Daisy down from the wagon. "Mrs. Dalton, this is Miss Daisy Harrington and her father, Matthew. They'll be staying with us from now on." The woman's sharp eyes took in everything, the way Flynn's hand lingered on Daisy's, the protective stance Matthew adopted behind his daughter, and the nervous hope in Daisy's expression. "About time this place had a woman's touch," she said approvingly.
Come in, dear.
"I've prepared rooms for you both and drawn baths. You must be exhausted from your journey." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustment. Matthew quickly took to his new role overseeing the eastern section of the ranch, earning the respect of the men under his supervision with his fair-minded approach and work ethic. Daisy, after years of managing a household alone, found herself with time on her hands. Mrs. Dalton ran the main house efficiently, and though she welcomed Daisy's help, she made it clear that the young woman was to consider herself a guest, not a servant. Mr. Blackwood was very specific. The housekeeper informed her when Daisy insisted on helping with the laundry. "You're to be treated as the lady of the house." The implication of those words made Daisy blush. Though Flynn had made his intentions increasingly clear over the weeks since his return to the homestead, they had not formally discussed marriage. Still, everyone on the ranch seemed to treat her as Flynn's intended, addressing her with deference and bringing household questions to her rather than Mrs. Dalton. Flynn himself was often busy from dawn till dusk, managing the daily operations of the ranch. But he always made time for Daisy, taking her on rides to show her the property, teaching her to fish in the stream that ran through the eastern meadow, and spending evenings on the porch, talking until the stars filled the sky. And when they could find moments of privacy, their physical relationship continued to develop. Flynn was patient, never pushing beyond what Daisy was comfortable with, but teaching her the pleasure to be found in increasingly passionate kisses and the gentle exploration of touch. One evening, about a month after their arrival at the ranch, Flynn suggested a ride to watch the sunset from a particular ridge he wanted to show her. Mrs. Dalton packed them a small supper, and they set off as the afternoon light began to soften. The spot Flynn had chosen offered a spectacular view of the valley below, with the ranch buildings miniaturized by distance and the mountains rising majestically beyond. They spread a blanket on a grassy area sheltered by a stand of pines and unpacked their meal. As they ate, Daisy found herself studying Flynn's profile, admiring the strong line of his jaw, the way the setting sun burnished his dark hair with hints of gold. How had her life changed so dramatically in such a short time? 2 months ago, she had been a lonely homesteader's daughter with limited prospects. Now she was here, in this beautiful place, with this man who looked at her as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever seen. "You're staring," Flynn observed with a smile, turning to meet her gaze. Daisy didn't look away. "I'm still trying to convince myself this is real. That I'm really here with you." Flynn set aside his plate and moved closer, taking her hand in his. "It's real, Daisy. And if I have any say in the matter, this is just the beginning." Her heart quickened at the intensity in his voice. The beginning of what? Instead of answering directly, Flynn reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. Daisy's breath caught as he loosened the drawstring and tipped a ring onto his palm, a delicate gold band set with a single perfect sapphire. "It was my mother's," he said softly. "My father gave it to me before he died, said I should save it for when I found a woman worthy of it." His eyes met hers, filled with an emotion that made her heart swell. "I've found her, Daisy. If you'll have me." For a moment, Daisy couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. This was happening faster than she had expected, yet she felt no doubt, no hesitation. "Are you certain?" she asked finally. "We've known each other such a short time." Flynn's smile was tender. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I knew from that first day, when you stood on your porch with your father's shotgun, refusing to be intimidated by danger. I knew when you crawled through that tunnel to save your father, and again when you tended my wound with such gentle hands." He paused, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I love you, Daisy Harrington. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Daisy's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Flynn slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as if it had been made for her. Then he leaned forward to seal their engagement with a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. As the kiss deepened, Daisy felt herself responding with a new boldness, her arms winding around his neck to draw him closer. Flynn's hands splayed across her back, pressing her against him as his lips left hers to trail along her jawline and down to the sensitive skin of her neck. "Flynn," she gasped, both thrilled and slightly frightened by the intensity of the sensations coursing through her. He pulled back immediately, his breathing ragged.
"I'm sorry."
"I got carried away." "Don't apologize," Daisy said, surprised by her own boldness. I liked it." Flynn's eyes darkened, but he maintained his distance. "All the more reason to set a wedding date soon," he said with a rueful smile. "Your father would have my hide if he knew how much I want to show you right now." The implication of his words sent heat flooding through Daisy's body. They had never explicitly discussed what would happen after marriage, but she had gleaned enough from overheard conversations between married women to have a general understanding of physical intimacy. "How soon?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Flynn tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering on her cheek. "That depends on what kind of wedding you want. If it were up to me, I'd ride into town tomorrow and find a preacher." Daisy considered this. She had no family besides her father, no close friends to invite. "I don't need anything elaborate," she decided. "Just you, and my father to give me away." Flynn's expression softened. "Are you sure? Most women dream of a grand wedding." "I'm not most women," Daisy reminded him with a smile. "And my dreams have changed." She looked down at the sapphire gleaming on her finger. "I never imagined I could be this happy, Flynn. I don't need a fancy wedding to make it official." He kissed her again, more gently this time. 2 weeks, he said against her lips. "That will give us time to arrange for a minister and for my sister and her husband to travel from Helena." 2 weeks, Daisy agreed, her heart soaring at the thought that in such a short time she would be Flynn Blackwood's wife. The sun had set by the time they gathered their things and mounted their horses for the ride back to the ranch. The news of their engagement spread quickly among the hands, and by morning, the entire ranch was buzzing with anticipation for the upcoming wedding. Matthew took Flynn aside the following day, and though Daisy wasn't privy to their conversation, her father emerged from Flynn's study with a satisfied expression and gave his blessing with heartfelt emotion. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become," he told Daisy privately. "And she would approve of Flynn. He's a good man with a good heart." The 2 weeks before the wedding passed in a flurry of preparations. Flynn's sister, Fiona, arrived with her husband a week before the ceremony and immediately took Daisy under her wing, insisting on a trip to Helena to purchase fabric for a proper wedding dress. Though Daisy protested that her best Sunday dress would suffice, Fiona was adamant. "My brother may be willing to marry you in sackcloth, but you deserve to feel like a bride on your wedding day." The shopping expedition resulted in yards of cream-colored silk and lace that Mrs. Dalton and Fiona transformed into a gown more beautiful than anything Daisy had ever owned. When she tried it on for the final fitting the day before the wedding, the women stepped back to admire their handiwork. "You look like an angel," Fiona declared, wiping away a tear. Flynn won't know what hit him. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers across the ranch. Flynn had arranged for a minister from the nearest town to perform the ceremony in the garden behind the main house, where a simple arch had been erected and decorated with native blooms. As Daisy stood in her room, allowing Mrs. Dalton to arrange her hair with tiny white flowers, a sense of calm certainty settled over her. Despite the whirlwind nature of her courtship with Flynn, she felt no doubt, no hesitation about the steps she was about to take. A knock at the door announced her father's arrival. Matthew entered, dressed in a new suit Flynn had insisted on having made for him, looking both uncomfortable in the formal attire and bursting with pride. "Look at you," he said softly, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Just like your mother on our wedding day." Daisy embraced him, careful not to wrinkle her gown. "I wish she could be here." "She is, in a way," Matthew assured her. "In you." He offered his arm. "They're waiting, ready to become Mrs. Blackwood." Daisy's smile was radiant as she took his arm. More than ready. The garden had been transformed for the occasion, with rows of chairs for the ranch hands and a few neighbors who had been invited to witness the ceremony. As Daisy and her father rounded the corner of the house, a collective murmur of appreciation rose from the assembled guests. But Daisy had eyes only for Flynn, who stood waiting beneath the flower-adorned arch. He was handsomely dressed in a dark suit, his hair neatly combed, but it was his expression as he caught sight of her that took her breath away, a look of such love and wonder that it made her heart swell almost painfully in her chest. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion. Daisy would later remember little of the minister's words, but the moment when Flynn slipped a gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring was etched into her memory forever, along with the tender kiss they shared as husband and wife. The celebration that followed was joyous, with music provided by several talented ranch hands and enough food to feed an army, thanks to Mrs. Dalton's preparations. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the festivities, Flynn led his bride in their first dance as a married couple. "Happy, Mrs. Blackwood," he murmured as they swayed to the music. "Completely," Daisy answered, nestling closer to him. "Though I'm still getting used to my new name." Flynn's arms tightened around her. "We have a lifetime for you to practice." As darkness fell and lanterns were lit around the garden, Flynn quietly suggested they might slip away from the celebrations. Daisy felt a flutter of nervous anticipation as they made their excuses and retreated to the main house. Flynn had arranged for their wedding night to be spent in the master bedroom, which had been prepared with fresh linens and vases of wildflowers. Once the door closed behind them, Daisy stood in the center of the room, suddenly shy despite the intimacies they had already shared. Flynn approached her slowly, his expression gentle. "We don't have to rush anything," he assured her, taking her hands in his. "We have all night, all our lives." Daisy looked up at him, at this man who had changed her world in so many ways, and felt her shyness melt away, replaced by a certainty that this was exactly where she belonged. "I love you, Flynn Blackwood," she said softly. "And I want to be your wife in every way." His eyes darkened at her words, and he leaned down to capture her lips in a kiss that started gently but quickly deepened into something more urgent. As his hands moved to the buttons at the back of her gown, Daisy surrendered herself to the love she saw in his eyes and the future they would build together. In the years that followed, the Blackwood Ranch prospered under Flynn's leadership and Matthew's experienced assistance. The house that had once seemed too large for a bachelor became filled with the sounds of children as Daisy gave birth first to twins, a boy and a girl, followed 2 years later by another son. Flynn proved to be as devoted a father as he was a husband, teaching his children to ride almost as soon as they could walk, telling them stories by the fire on winter evenings, and instilling in them the same values of hard work and integrity that had guided his own life. Daisy blossomed in her role as wife, mother, and mistress of the ranch. The timid homesteader's daughter gradually gave way to a confident woman who managed the household with quiet efficiency, tended to sick ranch hands with the same care she showed her own family, and rode alongside her husband to check the far boundaries of their property. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard, Flynn presented Daisy with a leather-bound journal. "What's this?" she asked, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "Open it," Flynn encouraged. Inside, she found page after page filled with Flynn's neat handwriting, the story of how they met, of her bravery in helping him escape the Callaways, of his journey back to her, and of the moment she told him she'd never been kissed. "I want our children to know the story someday," Flynn explained. "Of how their mother's courage and kindness changed my life. Of how sometimes love comes when you least expect it." Daisy's eyes filled with tears as she read the final page, where Flynn had written, "And though many years have passed since that first kiss we shared by the fireplace in her father's cabin, I still feel the same wonder when I kiss her now. For in teaching Daisy how to love, I learned the greatest lesson of my own life, that sometimes the bravest act is opening your heart to another, and the greatest adventure is the one you build together, day by day." Closing the journal, Daisy leaned against her husband's shoulder, watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. From that frightening evening when a wounded stranger had appeared at her door to this peaceful moment surrounded by the family they had created together, her life had taken a turn she could never have imagined. "Any regrets?" Flynn asked softly, his arm tightening around her shoulders. Daisy looked up at him, at the face that had become as familiar to her as her own, at the blue eyes that still looked at her with the same love they had shown on their wedding day, and smiled. "Not a single one," she answered truthfully, and reached up to draw his lips down to hers in a kiss that held all the sweetness of their first, and all the promise of their future. And as the sun set over the Blackwood Ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Daisy reflected that some journeys begin with a single step, or in her case, with opening a door to a stranger in need. That simple act of kindness had led her to a life filled with more love and happiness than she had ever dared to dream possible. It had all begun with a desperate man seeking shelter, a brave young woman willing to help, and a first kiss that had changed both their lives forever.